Welcome to the video lectures by SMBT Medical College and Hospital, Dhamangaon, Nashik. I am Dr. Nitin Baste. I am Associate Professor in Department of General Surgery. I am taking this lecture on anterior abdominal wall. So, in this lecture, I will teach you about the anatomy of the anterior abdominal wall and the diseases which arises from the anterior abdominal wall. So, the first year topic, anterior abdominal wall anatomy. So, the potential questions asked on this topic is describe the surgical anatomy of the anterior abdominal wall and describe any clinical features, etiology and treatment of any ventral hernias. Okay, so I think 1 or 2 years back this was a long question. Describe surgical anatomy of the anterior abdominal wall, describe clinical feature and management of incisional hernia. So coming to the clinical anatomy or surgical anatomy of the anterior abdominal wall. So as you know, anterior abdominal wall is the anterior part of the abdomen which protects the abdominal viscera, like solid viscera, liver, kidney, intestine, pancreas, stomach. Okay, so what are its functions? So it protects the intra-abdominal viscera. Again, it is a flexible structure, so it is responsible for flexibility of the abdomen. Again, it is responsible for rotation of the abdomen or rotation of the trunk. Okay, so flexion, extension of the trunk, anterior abdominal wall is helpful. So coming to the anatomy. So this is umbilicus. So anterior abdominal wall comprises of skin, then umbilicus, then superficial fascia, deep fascia, then anterior rectus sheath, posterior rectus sheath, linea alba, external oblique muscle, internal oblique muscle, fascia transversalis abdominis muscle, then fascia transversalis, then preperitoneal space and then peritoneum. Okay, so consider this as umbilical. So this is a midline. So this is a subcostal area, this is a xiphoid region, this is a subcostal region. So this is umbilicus. So this is a pubic symphysis. So there are two muscles which runs parallel to the midline, in midline. These are the rectus abdominis muscles. We are seeing this anatomy from the anterior aspect. So this is rectus abdominis muscle. So rectus abdominis muscles originates from the pubic symphysis and pubic crest. So it arises at the inferior side from the pubic symphysis and pubic crest. It grows upwards and inserts on the 5th, 6th and 7th rib. So it inserts on the 5th, 6th and 7th rib. So this is a two muscles in the near the midline. So this midline is linea alba, this is umbilicus. These are two rectus abdominis muscles, and there are three lateral abdominal muscles called as the external oblique, then the internal oblique and then the transverse abdominis muscles. As we go further, we will see the details of this anatomy. So below the skin there is a superficial fascia. There are two layers of the superficial fascia, the superficial fatty layer and deep membranous layer. Okay, remember this could be your MCQ. So superficial fatty layer also called as Camper's layer, deep membranous layer also called as Scarpa's layer. Okay, so the superficial layer is comprises of mainly a fatty, it's a thin layer, and the deep membranous layer comprises of the connective tissue and collagen. So it is little bit a tough structures. Okay, so superficial is Camper's and deep is Scarpa's layer. Below this superficial layer is the deep fascia of the abdominal wall. So deep fascia again extend from the subcostal region to the thoracolumbar fascia and inferiorly near the inguinal ligament and penis and the scrotum. Okay, so deep fascia of the abdominal wall continues with the penile fascia also called as Buck's fascia. Also called as Buck's fascia. Again is a MCQ. So Scarpa's layer ke below is the deep fascia. Deep fascia in the penile region continues with the deep fascia of the penis also called as the Buck's fascia. So superficial fascia ke दो layers है, Camper's and Scarpa's. So Scarpa's again goes continuation in the pelvis and pubis and scrotum. So in scrotum it continues at Colles fascia. So deep membranous layer that is called as Scarpa's layer continues in the scrotum as a Colles fascia, and the deep fascia of the abdomen continues in the penis as a Buck's fascia. So these are two MCQs in these two fascia. Okay. So below this deep fascia is a midline structures called as linea alba. So what is linea alba? A linea alba is a tendinous structures which is formed due to a decussating fibers from the anterior rectus sheath, from the both side of the anterior rectus sheath. So it is a intermingle area of the anterior rectus sheath. So it's a tub structures. Okay. So I'm drawing a figure so that you can understand it better. Suppose this is the linea alba, this is external oblique muscle, this is internal oblique muscle, and this is transverse abdominis muscle. So these are both sides muscles, external oblique muscle, internal oblique muscles, and transverse abdominis muscle. So each muscle has a aponeurosis, each muscle has its separate aponeurosis. So each muscle has its anterior aponeurosis and posterior, or anterior lamina of aponeurosis, posterior lamina of aponeurosis. So each muscle, external oblique has anterior and posterior, internal oblique has anterior and posterior, transverse abdominis has anterior and posterior. Okay. So these aponeurosis form the anterior rectus sheath and posterior rectus sheath. Okay. How these laminae or how these aponeurosis form the anterior rectus sheath, we will see. So anterior rectus sheath is formed by the both the lamina or both the aponeurosis of the external oblique and anterior aponeurosis of the internal oblique. So anterior rectus sheath is formed by both the aponeurosis of the external oblique and anterior aponeurosis of internal oblique. Then the posterior rectus sheath is formed by the posterior lamina of the internal oblique and both the lamina of the transversus abdominis. Okay, got it? So these are on both sides. So anterior rectus sheath is formed by both the lamina of the internal oblique and anterior lamina of the internal oblique, and the posterior rectus sheath is formed by the posterior lamina of the internal oblique and both the lamina of the transversus abdominis. So this is a posterior rectus sheath and this is a anterior rectus sheath, and in these both the sheaths there lies the muscle called as the rectus abdominis muscle. Okay. Okay, there are, again this is umbilicus, this is linea alba, this is rectus abdominis muscle. There is one line, a hypothetical line called as semilunar line, Semilunar line runs on the lateral aspect of rectus abdominis muscles from subcostal region to pubic symphysis. There is one more line called as semicircularis line. This is semilunar line, this is semicircularis line, or also called as arcuate line, So these two lines meet each other at the laterally and inferior aspect of the umbilicus, and this is called as Spiegel's point. So what are the importance of these lines? Okay. So the fascia, the aponeurosis which is medial to this semilunar line is called anterior rectus sheath, and what is lateral is called as external oblique aponeurosis. Okay. As you know the formation of anterior rectus sheath and posterior rectus sheath, this is semicircularis line or also called as arcuate line. Posterior rectus sheath is extended till arcuate line only. It is deficient below the arcuate line. So anterior rectus sheath extend from the subcostal region to the pubic symphysis, but the posterior rectus sheath extend from the subcostal region to the arcuate line only. So the area between the arcuate line and the pubic symphysis, there is a lacking of posterior rectus sheath. So the muscle is directly in contact with the fascia transversalis or preperitoneal area. So these are two importance of this. We will see here is sometimes there is a weakness and there is hernia coming from this Spiegel's point called as Spiegelian hernia. I will explain it in after some time. So this is semilunar line, this is semicircularis line, also called as arcuate line, which meet each other at the laterally and below the umbilicus, that is called as Spiegel's point. External anterior rectus sheath is present throughout from the subcostal region to the pubic symphysis, but the posterior rectus sheath present from the subcostal region to the arcuate line, and the posterior rectus sheath is deficient below the arcuate line. So the muscle is directly in contact with the preperitoneal fascia or fascia transversalis. Okay, so there are two vessels which run below the rectus abdominis muscle. It's called as a superior epigastric artery, and one more is the inferior epigastric artery. Superior epigastric artery is a continuation of internal mammary artery which gives perforator to the rectus abdominis muscle as well as the anterior rectus sheath as well as the linea alba. Inferior epigastric artery is a branch of external iliac artery which also gives a perforator to the rectus abdominis muscles, anterior rectus sheath and umbilicus. Okay, so this is the surgical anatomy of the anterior abdominal wall. Coming to the most common disease arising from the anterior abdominal wall is a ventral hernia. Okay, so ventral hernia. Ventral hernia is a hernia arises from the anterior abdominal wall. It comprises of umbilical hernia. Then it comprises of epigastric hernia, then incisional hernia, then parastomal hernia, umbilical hernia, epigastric hernia, incisional hernia, parastomal hernia, lumbar hernia, then Spigelian hernia, then traumatic hernia, okay. So these are few ventral hernias. There are some rare hernias like gluteal or sacral hernia, gluteal and sacral hernia, perineal hernia, obturator hernia. So these are some common hernias from the anterior abdominal wall, and these are some rare hernias from the anterior abdominal wall. Coming to the first, that is a umbilical hernia. That is a umbilical hernia. Coming to the slight anatomy of the umbilicus. Umbilicus is a fibrous structures covered by a skin where there is a fibrous ring, and on that fibrous ring comes few ligaments like a falciform ligament from the upper part and median umbilical ligament from the lower part and medial umbilical ligament. Okay. So this is umbilicus. This is umbilicus, a fibrous ring-shaped structures. Here comes the falciform ligament from the upper aspect. Here comes the median umbilical ligament, and here comes the medial umbilical ligament. Medial umbilical ligament. Okay, don't confuse. This is median this is median, and these laterals are medial. Okay, and this is a falciform ligament. This is falciform ligament, and this is umbilicus, central part. So all these structures goes here near the fibrous ring covered by a skin called as umbilicus. Okay, so anteriorly umbilicus is covered by skin, posteriorly umbilicus is covered by a preperitoneum or umbilical fascia. Umbilical fascia. So umbilical hernia is nothing but a defect in the umbilical ring or a umbilical fascia. So umbilical hernia can be seen in children or can be seen in adults. So it could be a congenital umbilical hernia or also called as a adult umbilical hernia. So congenital umbilical hernia, again more common in premature children, malnourished children, IUGR children, more common in IUGR children. Okay, as you know, umbilicus is the site of insertion of the umbilical cord. Umbilicus is the site of insertion of the umbilical cord. So after birth, the obstetrician ligate the umbilical cord, and after few days that umbilical cord, remaining part of the umbilical cord gets shreds away, and the site where the umbilical cord enters into the body, this is called as fibrous ring, which gets obliterated in few days or few weeks. If it is not obliterated, then it is converted into a umbilical hernia. If it is not obliterated, then it is converted into a umbilical hernia. So it's more common in premature children, IUGR children or malnourished children. Okay, so when patient or when child cries there is a conical shaped swelling near the umbilicus, so that is a umbilical hernia. So protruding of the intra-abdominal contents to the umbilicus is umbilical hernia. Okay, so what are the clinical features? Clinical feature is a conical swelling near the umbilicus. After birth, when patient cries, that conical swelling increases on size. Sometimes there is a pain due to obstruction of the bowel or obstruction of the omentum. So what is the investigations? So no need to do a further investigations, only a clinically you can diagnose a umbilical hernia. So what is treatment for umbilical hernia in childhood? Suppose patient is asymptomatic and it's very small defect, then no need to do treatment. So less than 2 centimeter and more than 2 centimeter. So less than 2 centimeter, there are chances of spontaneous regression of the umbilical hernia. In less than 2 centimeter, there are chances of spontaneous regression as the age progresses of the child. But if the size is more than 2 centimeter, then there are less chances of regression of the umbilical hernia. So in less than 2 centimeter, you can give a conservative treatment. And in more than 2 centimeter, you can go ahead with a operative surgery. But there is a dictum that you should wait at least for 2 years. To see whether this is persistent or whether it is going to regress. So at the age of 2 years, again you assess the child. If the hernia is not regressed, then you can go ahead with the surgery. So in surgery, give a smiling transverse incision below the umbilicus. Cut the skin, then identify the sac, and then identify the defect. Push the sac inside the abdomen, and close the defect with a non-absorbable suture. Okay, non-absorbable sutures like Prolene or Ethilone. Okay, so less than 2 years conservative treatment, less than 2 centimeter conservative, more than 2 centimeter operative intervention. No need to push a mesh in a congenital hernia. Okay, so there are very less chances that congenital hernia will land up into complications like obstruction or strangulation. Okay, coming to the adult umbilical hernia. Coming to the adult umbilical hernia, the causes of the adult umbilical hernia are somehow different, like obesity, pregnancy, or any intra-abdominal tumors, or the causes of distension of abdomen, like liver diseases, ascites, or intra-abdominal tumors. Okay. Then common causes of hernia, like constipation, increased straining at micturition, increased straining at defecation. This also predisposes for the umbilical hernia. Okay. So what are the pathophysiology of the umbilical hernia? So there is the umbilicus, there is umbilical ring or fibrous ring that is obliterated in the adult age group. But if the intra-abdominal pressure rises, this fibrous ring expands. Which gives rise to a umbilical hernia. As I already told you the causes, like obesity, pregnancy, liver diseases, or the complication of liver diseases like ascites, intra-abdominal tumors, cough, constipation, increased straining at micturition. So these are some causes of the adult umbilical hernia. Coming to the clinical features, again clinical features you can divide into a simple umbilical hernia or a complicated umbilical hernia. So in simple umbilical hernia, there is only a small swelling near the umbilicus, maybe at the inferior aspect of the umbilicus or superior aspect of the umbilicus. Then there is slight pain. So pain is due to the stretching of the peritoneum. So pain is due to sometimes there is a bowel into the sac, there is a omentum into the sac. So there could be a pain near the umbilical side. If the umbilical hernia gets complicated, like obstruction, irreducibility, or strangulation, then sometimes there is a severe pain in the umbilicus, then fever, then edema at the local site, discoloration at the local site. Okay. Coming to the investigations of the umbilical hernia, as you know, hernia is a clinical diagnosis, but to diagnose the cause of the hernia, you should do a certain investigations. In umbilical hernia, to diagnose the umbilical defect or the content of the sac, you should do ultrasonography of the abdomen. So UHG abdomen is the preferred investigations to diagnose the defect of the umbilical hernia and the content of the umbilical hernia. And also UHG is helpful to diagnose the any liver diseases like or complication of the liver diseases like ascites. Also UHG also is a good for to diagnose the intra-abdominal tumors. Okay, so the first investigations you should do a UHG. But if you are suspecting a obstruction into the umbilical hernia, then you should do a X-ray abdomen erect. So X-ray abdomen erect, you will find out the air fluid level suggestive of the intestinal obstruction. Okay, so these two investigations should be done. If the umbilical hernia is more complicated, like in obese patients or in ascites patient or intra-abdominal tumor, then CT scan abdopelvis should be done to diagnose the cause of the intra-abdominal tumor or the source of the intra-abdominal tumor or any other complication other than the umbilical hernia complication. Coming to the treatment of the umbilical hernia, if the defect is very small, and patient is asymptomatic, then no need to treat the umbilical hernia. Umbilical hernia with a large swelling with a symptomatic umbilical hernia, you can go ahead with a treatment for umbilical hernia. So there are two modalities to treat the umbilical hernia. One is open surgery and second is a laparoscopic surgery. Okay, one is open and second is laparoscopic surgery. Again, in open surgery, if the defect size is less than 1 centimeter, then 1 to 2 centimeter and more than 2 centimeters. So there are three ways you can treat this umbilical hernia depending on the size of the umbilical defect. So less than 1 centimeter umbilical hernia, if asymptomatic, you can go ahead with a conservative surgery. But if patient comes to your OPD with a pain and increase in size of the swelling, then you can do a surgery. So in less than 1 centimeter size, you can go ahead with a open surgery Give a transverse incision below the umbilicus, dissect the skin, dissect the umbilical hernia sac, identify the defect. If the defect is less than 1 centimeter, then give a figure of 8 like suture by a non-absorbable suture like Prolene, like Ethilon. Okay, so less than 1 centimeter, figure of 8 like suture by a non-absorbable suture. If it is 1 to 2 centimeter, then again you can close the defect with the non-absorbable suture, by intermittent way. You can close this 1 to 2 centimeter defect with 1 to 2 centimeter defect with a intermittent non-absorbable sutures, or you can do a darning. A darning is like take a multiple suture, and then this put a knot on these sutures and again fix these sutures to a surrounding strong fascia like anterectus sheath or linea alba. So that is darning. Nowadays nobody prefers this method, so intermittent non-absorbable suture you can take. More than 2 centimeter, ideally you should put a mesh. So that is called as hernioplasty. So putting a mesh in the umbilical hernia surgery is called as hernioplasty. And as you know, non-absorbable mesh like made up of polypropylene, okay, low weight, high pore size mesh you can use near the umbilicus. Again, there are certain methods to put a mesh. There are certain methods to push a mesh. First is onlay, second is sublay, and last is inlay. Okay, onlay, sublay and inlay. So in onlay you put a mesh over anterior rectus sheath. So the basic steps are same: skin incision, dissect the umbilical hernia sac, identify the defect. Okay, if there is a small defect, push the sac into the abdomen and then the closure of the linea alba or anterectus sheath, and then put a mesh over the anterectus sheath. That is onlay. So mesh will be in the subcutaneous region. Again, this method is not a preferred method nowadays. Second is a sublay mesh placement. Behind the rectus abdominis muscle, and anterior to the posterior rectus sheath. So these are bilateral and muscles. We are seeing a transverse region. This is anterectus sheath and this is posterior rectus sheath. So go in this direction and put a mesh here behind the muscle and anterior to the posterior rectus sheath. That is called as sublay mesh placement, also called as a retromuscular placement of the mesh. So sublay mesh placement is also called as retromuscular placement of the mesh. And the inlay technique where you can put a mesh into the peritoneal side, into the peritoneal aspect. So these mesh are different type of mesh. Sometimes a PTFE meshes are used, polytetrafluoroethylene mesh, which has two layers. One is for anteabdominal wall and one is for a peritoneum. The layer for peritoneum is a smooth layer where the bowel will not adhere. So in inlay you can put a mesh from the peritoneal side of the aspect. Okay, so this is a open method. So in old literature or in old books, there is one method of repair which is mentioned called as Mayo's repair. That is called as Mayo's repair. Mayo's repair is also called as a double breasting of the anterectus sheath. Double breasting of the anterectus sheath. Suppose this is umbilicus, this is umbilical hernia. give a transverse incision on skin below the umbilicus, dissect the umbilical sac, then identify the defect. Then you can actually, suppose this is a defect, now you should enlarge this defect a little bit, laterally. So now defect will like this. Okay, so it has a upper lip and a lower lip. So defect has a upper lip and lower lip. So now you should cover this upper lip and lower lip. Suppose this is a defect, upper lip and lower lip. So lower lip should go below the upper lip and upper lip should cover the lower lip by 3 to 4 centimeter. So before, normally this is anterectus sheath like this, but in Mayo's repair you are creating two anterectus sheath, or two layers of the anterectus sheath. So lower lip goes below the upper lip and upper lip comes above the lower lip, so that it is called as a double breasting of the anterectus sheath. So this is called as a Mayo's repair. Coming to the laparoscopic repair of the umbilical hernia. Again, the principle is same in open and in laparoscopic hernia. We should cover the defect with a mesh. So in open repair, we go below the umbilical, incision is below the umbilicus, but in laparoscopic, you should put a 3 tokars, preferably on the left side of the abdomen. Do a pneumoperitoneum with the CO2 gas, then identify the defect. If the sac contains the small intestine or omentum, then you should dissect all these small intestine and omentum. That is called as a reduction of the contents of the hernia sac. Then you can put a mesh over the defect, that is called as IPOM, intraperitoneal onlay mesh repair, that is called as IPOM. So the mesh will come on the peritoneal aspect, that is called as IPOM. Again, there is newer treatment for laparoscopic umbilical hernia, or in any laparoscopic ventral hernia, also called as ETEP, that is endoscopic total extraperitoneal repair. So you go in the extraperitoneal space, dissect that extraperitoneal space, go on the opposite side, reduce the content, put a mesh in the extraperitoneal area. Before putting the mesh, you should suture the defect of the umbilical hernia. So this is a newer modality. So extra skills are required for the ETEP, and this is the old modality of the laparoscopic hernia called as IPOM repair. Okay. So laparoscopic umbilical hernia, nowadays a widely accepted technique to repair the umbilical hernia. What are the complications of the umbilical hernia? Again, any complication of the hernia like obstruction and strangulation. So what if the patient presented to your OPD or emergency with a obstructed umbilical hernia or a strangulated umbilical hernia? So patient may be in the septic shock, or patient may be in the hypovolemic shock, hypotension. So the first treatment you should give is the correction of the shock. So ABCD comes in the picture. So correction of the shock is the preferred method of treatment in the obstruction or strangulated umbilical hernia. Then you should treat the disease by going by a open method. Normally laparoscopic methods are contraindicated in a strangulation umbilical hernia, because there could be a bowel injury while dissecting the bowel or while reduction the contents of the hernia. So the open method is preferred. Give a vertical skin incision, identify the hernia sac, open the hernia sac, see whether the contents is omentum or intestine. If there is intestine, see the color of the intestine. If the intestine is normal, then push the intestine into the abdomen, and then do a normal hernia surgery like hernioplasty. But if there is a strangulation, there is a gangrene of the bowel, then you should resect the gangrenous component. And do the bowel anastomosis. So now this case converted into a clean contaminated case. So in that case you cannot use the mesh, because there are high chances of mesh infection. So after anastomosis, put a drain, intra-abdominal drain, then do a herniorrhaphy by closing the linea alba in the midline, and then putting again a drain in the subcutaneous space, and then the skin closure. Okay, so in strangulated umbilical hernia you cannot use the mesh because there are high chances of mesh infection. Coming to the second ventral hernia, epigastric hernia. So any hernia between the umbilicus and xiphoid process is called as the epigastric hernia. So any hernia between the umbilicus and the xiphoid is called as the epigastric hernia. Okay, so epigastric hernia are more common in males, or common in both in males and females, common in middle-aged patients, again it's common in obesity, To start with, epigastric hernia start as a transverse. Suppose this is a linea alba, so it starts as a transverse tear, in the linea alba. Okay, so where this transverse tear occurs, so the hypotheses are like this. There are, linea alba is what? A decussating fibers of the anterectus sheath, and posterior sheath. Okay, so suppose these decussating fibers are defective or weak, then linea alba will become weak, and any disease which raises the intra-abdominal pressure will give rise to a epigastric hernia. The second hypothesis is the superior epigastric artery runs below the rectus abdominis muscles. It gives the perforators to the anterectus sheath and linea alba. Where these vessels perforate the anterectus sheath or linea alba, there is a natural weakness in the linea alba. Because again these are gaps through which these vessels pass. So any disease which raises the intra-abdominal pressure, which enlarges these gaps, causing epigastric hernia. To start with, epigastric hernia is a transverse tear. Okay, so normally in hernia we see there is a sac and there is a intra-abdominal contents into the sac, but in epigastric hernia sometimes there is no sac, the only content is the extra peritoneal fat. There is an extra peritoneal fat only. So not necessary there should be always sac in the epigastric hernia to start with. As the hernia enlarges, then there is a peritoneal sac with the contents like falciparum ligament, omentum, sometimes stomach or sometimes bowel. But to start with, there is contents will be only the extra peritoneal fat. What are clinical features of epigastric hernia? There is a lump in the epigastric region, small swelling or small lump in the epigastric region. Sometimes it is a painless, but suppose this extra peritoneal fat and there is a small defect, the vascularity gets obliterated, then there is a infarction of this extra peritoneal fat, which gives rise to a pain. So there will be a slight pain in the epigastric region. Okay, so the most common investigations to diagnose this epigastric hernia is the ultrasonography of the abdomen. Ultrasonography of the abdomen will give rise to a defect size and the contents of the epigastric hernia. Okay, again the treatment for epigastric hernia again is open. Okay, generally epigastric hernias are a small size defect, so no need to put a mesh in the epigastric hernia. If the small size is less than 2 centimeter, then directly a repair of the defect with a non-absorbable suture. Okay, defect closure of the defect with the non-absorbable suture. If it is more than 2 centimeter, then you can put a mesh. Okay, again a laparoscopy can be used. Laparoscopy can be used, but as you know, what is the intra-abdominal organ which is present near the epigastric region below the anteabdominal wall? It is falciparum ligament. It is falciparum ligament. So on laparoscopy, sometimes the defect is not visualized. Defect is not visualized, or defect is not seen due to this falciparum ligament. Or sometimes defect is very small, that there is no proper hernia sac, no peritoneal sac. There is only extraperitoneal fat. So in that case, you need to incise the falciparum ligament, you need to incise the peritoneum, then go to the extraperitoneal space where you can identify the epigastric hernia sac. So again, a laparoscopy is a skillful and tedious surgery in epigastric hernia, where a defect, you cannot identify defect every time on the peritoneal side. So you need to be dissect a falciparum ligament and then preperitoneal area to see the defect. If you identify the defect, then you can close the defect. If the defect is large, then you can put a mesh. Okay, but generally in epigastric hernia, mesh is not required. Coming to the third hernia, that is called as incisional hernia. So as the word suggests, the hernia where there is an incision is called as incisional hernia. So suppose there is a patient with a past history of laparotomy 3-4 years back, and now comes to your OPD with a swelling. So your first diagnosis should be a incisional hernia. So incisional hernia is a herniation of the intra-abdominal contents through a previous scar. So what is etiology of incisional hernia? Again, etiology, you can divide it causes or etiology into the patient factor, wound factors and doctor factors. Okay, so you can divide causes into a patient factor, wound factor and doctor factor. So what are patient factors? Patient factors, again, obesity, pregnancy, malnutrition, immunocompromised stage, long-term steroid therapy, chronic cough, constipation, increased straining at micturition. These are all patient factors which gives rise to a incisional hernia in a previous care. What are wound factors? Wound factors are previous wound infections, current wound infections, or a fragile wound, like in old age patient there is a fragile structures or connective tissue. Then connective tissue disorders again are a wound factors. And in doctor factors are a poor technique of the suturing or poor choice of the suture material. These two can give rise to a incisional hernia. Okay, what are clinical features? Again, incisional hernia can extend throughout the suture line or throughout the scar, or could be into a part of the scar. Sometimes incisional hernia could be a multiple defects in the scar. So to start with, it is a small swelling, and then gradually it increases over the whole length of the scar. So swelling, then pain. Again, clinical features of the complications like obstruction and strangulation. Investigations to diagnose incisional hernia are ultrasonography and CT scan. Again, ultrasonography for the one defect or is a multiple defect, then defect size, then content of the sac, and then any other cause into the abdomen like ascites, liver diseases, intra-abdominal tumors. Okay, if the incisional hernia patient present with a obstruction or strangulation, then sometimes you need to do a CT abdo-pelvis to see whether it is truly obstructing or a strangulation hernia. Okay, coming to the treatment of the incisional hernia. Again, treatment is divided into open and laparoscopy. Again, we have seen the open treatment in umbilical hernia like onlay repair, sublay repair and inlay repair. So onlay, sublay and inlay. Again, these three surgeries you can do in incisional hernia procedure. Only mesh repair. After taking skin incision, identify the hernia sac, identify the hernia defect, then close the defect and put a mesh on the external oblique aponeurosis or anterectus sheath, that is onlay. Sublay repair again behind the rectus abdominis muscles and on the posterior rectus sheath, and inlay into the peritoneum. So again, these three surgeries you can do in the incisional hernia surgeries also. Laparoscopy, again same like umbilical hernia. Okay, same like umbilical hernia, IPOM and E-tape. The only difference is here the defect size is more, so that you should use a large mesh. Ideally a 5 centimeter of the defect edge should be covered. Suppose this is a 3 centimeter defect, then you should cover a 5 centimeter here, 5 centimeter here, 5 centimeter here and 5 centimeter here. So ideally you should cover, so these 5, these 3 and these 5, 5, 5, 10 and 3, 13. So ideally you should use 13 by 13 mesh in a 3 centimeter size defect. Again the defect is 5 centimeter, then you should use a 15 by 15 size mesh in a incisional hernia or umbilical hernia. The principles are again same. The only difference is there is a scar tissue, there is a interbowel adhesions into the hernia sac. There is newer entity nowadays called as large incisional hernia. That is called as a large incisional hernia. So large incisional hernia is a hernia where the hernia sac content or hernia sac volume is more than 25%, more than 25% of the abdominal volume. So the large incisional hernia is called as the hernia size volume or hernia sac volume more than 25% of the abdominal volume. It is diagnosed on a CT abdomen. So UHG is not a good investigation to diagnose a large incisional hernia. So CT abdopelvis is a good investigation to diagnose a large incisional hernia. Okay. So what is importance of this large incisional hernia? Again, your treatment modalities changes depending on this, whether the incisional hernia is large or small. Because incisional hernia is a chronic hernia where the contents of the abdomen are outside the abdomen for a certain period of time. So there is loss of abdomen domain, that is called as loss of abdomen domain. Abdominal contents are outside the abdomen or into the hernia sac for a long period of time. So there is a natural decrease in capacity of the abdomen. This is normal. There is a decrease in capacity of the abdomen due to this large incisional hernia. So after repair, you are pushing these contents into the abdomen. You are pushing these contents into the abdomen. So abdominal capacity is less due to this large incisional hernia, and you are pushing these contents into the abdomen after surgery. So there will be a compression of the IVC. There will be a compression of the diaphragm. So there will be a pulmonary complication. There will be a decreased venous return due to a compression on the IVC. So there are certain procedures or certain prophylactic tricks you can use to treat a large incisional hernia. Also, so if you are suspecting any large incisional hernia patient, reduce the content, okay, give him a abdominal binder, but this should be done with a caution, because if the contents come out and you tighten the abdominal belt, then there are chances of injury to the bowel. So reduce the content, give the proper abdominal belt, or sometimes a chronic pneumoperitoneum could be used. A repeated pneumoperitoneum should be used to increase the capacity of the abdomen. Repeated pneumoperitoneum should be done to increase the capacity of the abdomen. Then there are some procedures called as component separation technique. It is called as a Ramirez component separation technique. So what is this component separation technique? As you know, suppose the defect is very large. So defect is 15 centimeter. defect is 15 centimeter. These edges of the anterectus sheath or posterior sheath falls way away from the midline, If you try to approximate it, it will cause the tension on the suture line. If it get approximated, again it will compress the abdominal viscera. So there will be a intra-abdominal compartment syndrome. So to prevent this tension line or to prevent this internal compartment syndrome, we can use a component separation technique. So component separation technique is give a relaxing incision on the external oblique, internal oblique or fascia transversalis. Give a relaxation incision over the external oblique or transverse abdominis. So suppose this is abdominal wall. Give a relaxing incision on the external oblique. Go between external oblique and internal oblique for 5 to 6 centimeters. Again give an incision on the internal oblique. Here you don't need to give incision on the external oblique. You have given incision on the external oblique here. Go for 5 to 6 centimeter. Give an incision on the internal oblique. Again make a space between internal oblique and transverse abdominis. Again give an incision on the transverse abdominis. So this will relax the anterior abdominal wall. So we'll suppose this can be done bilaterally so that this can be approximated. But the large mesh should be used before repairing the anterectus sheath or before closing the anterectus sheath. So this is a component separation technique, also called as a Ramirez component separation technique. Okay. One more topic in incisional hernia: how to prevent the incisional hernia. So patient selection. Suppose there is an obese patient, ask patient to reduce the weight. Then after reduction of weight, you can go ahead with surgery. If patient is anemic, raise the HB by blood transfusion or by oral treatment. If the patient is on immunosuppression, if you can avoid the immunosuppression, then avoid for some time and go ahead for repair. But the best technique or best solution to prevent incisional repair is a surgeon's technique and to choose a suture material wisely. You can use a non-absorbable suture material. With a fine technique. Nowadays, previously we used to do 1 number or 10 suture material for the closure of linea alba or anterectus sheath. But nowadays, a 20 suture material is the ideal suture material used for a abdominal wall closure or linea alba closure. Okay. Previously we used to think that 1 centimeter wide and 1 centimeter depth. 1 centimeter wide, 1 centimeter depth. But nowadays a nearer suture with 20 is also good to prevent the incisional hernia repair. There is one formula. Suppose if there is a 10 centimeter incision and you want to close it, then ideally you should use the 40 centimeter suture. So there is a 1:4 ratio of the length of the incision to the suture. That is called as a Jenkins rule. So 10 centimeter incision, 40 centimeter suture line. Okay. So prevention of wound infection, higher antibiotic cover, then multivitamin tablets or multivitamin injectables in the post-operative period, early mobilization of the patient, Ryle's tube to prevent the paralytic ileus. This can be helpful to prevent the incisional hernia. Okay, so in this lecture we have covered anatomy of the anterior abdominal wall, umbilical hernia, epigastric hernia and incisional hernia. The potential questions could be a long question or short question and certain MCQs. Hope you all understand this. In next lecture we will cover the rest of the anterior abdominal wall hernias and the diseases of the umbilicus.